So welcome to, Matt, I think you need to understand just how special of a person you are. Welcome to episode 100 of the Luke Messiah Show. Yeah. So I am joined today by my friend, Matt Beebe, who has been a candidate, Republican activist, and candidate for the Texas legislature, ran against Joe Strauss, I think he's still a Republican who doesn't vote for most Republicans.
Nominally,
at this point.
right?
Yep.
Right.
Former Speaker of the House in the Texas legislature and fellow San Antonian now that I've moved into the city.
Welcome.
And you also have since, over the last several years, become a writer. You write for The Federalist and several other publications on various different issues. And I have brought you in to talk about what's happened this week, about what is going to be happening in the Texas legislature, previewing a little bit of that that has yet to come. And so, yeah, we're going to sit down and hash out a couple of the world's problems. So thank you for joining me.
Hey, I appreciate it, Luke. It's good to be here always. I think the last time we sat down, you were audio only, and we were in a different environment and everything. I mean, between you and Joe Rogan, clearly podcasting is taking a step up over the last year or two.
It is. It's a massive upward trajectory.
Yeah. I mean, the glow up between you and Joe is like pretty good stuff.
What's even weirder is that our listeners haven't changed at all. Throughout the upgrades,
right?
We still got it's just mainly my mom. This is what I tell people. If you want to know, my mom will definitely hear you, and then maybe a couple other Texans.
Well, my mom will listen to this one, so we're doubling your listenership
Twice as a base.
Yep.
Okay, I just can't figure out how to keep the moms coming back. It's just the mom of whoever is listening. So. This week, we're not going to dwell on everything that happened in Washington, D.C. Yeah. Honestly, I just think that what is one other person's take on this going to do for society, right? Agreed. So we're not going to spend too much time. I do think it's important to kind of take us back. I mean, rioting at the Capitol is something that we here in Texas have a little bit more familiarity with, right?
Sure. Yeah. I remember 2013 legislative session, the HB or SB 5, right? The abortion bill.
Yep.
They shut down the Senate.
Yep.
And, really actually, we can get into the specifics of what happened this week in Washington, but recall back in 2013, they killed a bill. They affected the legislative outcomes of that legislative session by forcing, basically forcing the counter past midnight.
I think a lot of Texas, the truth is that even a decent amount of our listeners were not that politically engaged in 2013. They were engaged, many of them 2016, 2018, just in the last several years. And so, but they know Wendy Davis. They know that she ran against Chip Roy. They know that she had this kind of, moment. But to recap, June of 2013, legislation was moving through the Texas legislature that was going to ban abortions after 20 weeks, right? And so Wendy Davis stood up to filibuster it, which is let's say a norm. It's decorum. It's tradition. It is a right afforded to these different senators to take action on. But what was not planned is what transpired, which is that thousands and thousands and thousands of people came as kind of a battle cry, actually kind of not unlike some of the things, and it's not identical, but basically come take a stand with me. I'm going to take a stand for you. You stand with me, right? Thousands of Texans show up. And then the process starts to look like actually this pro-life legislation is going to pass. And at this point in time, thousands of Texans and some out-of-state people who were there to protest lost their ever-loving minds, started screaming, started throwing things, started fighting with the police, shouted to the extent that senators could not even communicate with each other, right?
Yep.
So then the business of the Senate could not even be conducted before the clock struck midnight. And I was in the Capitol at this point. We were on lockdown. We were in, it was interesting because when I came into the Capitol that day, there was orange and blue. So if you were wearing orange, it meant you were okay with ending the lives of innocent children. And if you were blue, it meant you were trying to, ban abortion after 20 weeks. And there was this circle of like Wiccans dressed in orange chanting, doing these big chants. And then this group of like pro-life people got together and started praying, and then the Wiccans came over, and there was like this prayer war that went on at one point that I witnessed, and that was not something you witness every day. But then you realize like this is really happening. There's a lot of tensions. People really do believe what they believe when they're here. And so people started losing their minds when this happened, and then it just broke loose, and everybody was locked down in their offices, everything, every door and everything was locked. Unlike what happened in DC, where people were like actually getting into these offices. People did not get into the offices, probably because if like all the Republican lawmakers were either there, like in the actual session, or they were in their offices. And I don't know if you want to break into a Texas Republican legislator's office and, I don't know what's on the other side of that door.
There's definitely a different experience that folks would have. Now, I do want to correct one aspect of what you just said there, Luke, because it's important to remember you said that it wasn't planned. Well, I suspect it's a fair statement to say it wasn't expected to turn out the way that it did.
Yep.
But when you've got protesters that show up in the gallery with the equipment to lock themselves and chain themselves
there
to
were
the
definitely
gallery
some
rail,
people,
there was some premeditated.
and I guess that
aspect
goes
to
to somewhat of a hearkening back to this week in Washington D.C., where if thousands of people show up, there are definitely going to be some people that show up there with a plan of doing something more than what maybe even everybody else is planning on doing. Right.
Well, I want to hit on one thing in regards to that day back in 2013, and you mentioned Wendy Davis. So recall that maybe a lot of the listeners and viewers might not remember her. From or might not have known her then.
Yep.
But in 2013, they probably didn't know her either. She started that day with 1,200 Twitter followers, right? And then through the efforts of that, she became amplified, became a darling of the left. Even the president had, tacitly approved what was going on there in the Senate with his tweet. There's something special going on in Austin today. And so the way that the left has been able to capture some of this civic unrest in ways in which amplifies their cause and really, frankly, wipes away the stain of that bond of civic trust, right? Because let's get into that in a minute, where we talk about why some of this stuff is bad. Like there's civil disobedience, there's a place for protests, all of those sorts of things have a part in our democracy. But there's a level and a line that has been crossed clearly this week in Washington, D.C., just like it was back in 2013 in Austin. But we see in that contrast, there's a willingness to sort of gloss over that when it's sort of an approved cause of the left, and it's norm shattering, end of the world kind of dark times when it happens in the right. And this isn't a whataboutism. It's not an equivalency sort of thing, but I think we need to have that context because there is some nuance to this conversation.
The when we talk about civil unrest, I think one thing that I found myself thinking about when everyone was reacting the day this all went down, I think one of the reasons why I wasn't so worked up over what was going on, and that could be interpreted by someone to like take away like, oh, you don't care about this happening, negative, positive, anything like that. And I don't think it was a good thing that happened, if anybody's wondering. But I've literally been witnessing bad things happening, even to the point of civil unrest, violence, things that we would consider laws being broken, norms being run over, and a country whose elite institutions have largely whitewashed 2020, meaning we had a year of civil unrest and it was treated like it was not a year of civil unrest. Yeah. We start 2021 and people go, I want a new year, right? All this new feeling, we're going to move on. We have an instance of civil unrest. That's what it was. It was definitely not, and it becomes focused on and treated like the most horrific, and when I say the most horrific, walking away of the norms of our society. Like this is a point in time that we have moved in a certain direction. And in some ways it's like an ignoring of the fact that we've literally been moving here for a significant period of time. Right. And that's where the question is, how are you weighing the occurrences of a week without the context of a year, or even the context of 6 years, 8 years? I just go back to the reason I brought up 2013 to start is I was in a Capitol that was on lockdown, right? And literally people sitting there going like, do not leave this office. We don't know if it is safe for you to leave this office. And the people I was with were all pro-life individuals who were there to pass the law that everybody roaming the halls and breaking things and getting ticked off were there to defeat, right?
Right.
And so I don't even say that to point a finger and go, ah ha ha, if this guy messes up, well, your guy messed up, because that doesn't help the situation. But
Obviously.
it's just to say, that's why I'm not freaking out. Like, how could this ever happen in our America, right? I mean, I feel like if you plop someone down who was in America 20 years ago, or I don't know, 10 or 50 or whatever, maybe he goes, oh, this doesn't seem like the America that I was aware of. But I feel like anybody who's walked through this year would say, oh yeah, civil unrest, violence, that seems like par for the course within a lot of, our society today, unfortunately.
Well, and I think what you see, at least what I've seen in talking to a lot of people of different ideologies and different backgrounds, is that the Trump phenomenon over the last 4 years in particular has caused such a wedge, rhetorically, and we're already at a point in our nation's sort of history where we're pretty polarized, right? Mm-hmm. But President Trump became that lightning rod for a lot of that on the left, even on the right. He sort of became that inflection point, and so there's a lot of amnesia about what came before Trump, and like everything that's happening bad right now is reflective of Trump. Yep. And there's always an inflection point, right? In anything in history, there's always some point where enough is enough. But I think what we're seeing now, at least in my view, is that while this might be that inflection point for the left, the inflection point for the right really was many months or longer back, where they've said enough is enough. And in fact, what we saw this week, I think, for a lot of those folks, certainly the vast majority, hundreds of thousands of people that were there peacefully literally not, and I'm not using the rhetorical flourish of peaceful protest
mostly
in that
peaceful
way,
protests,
but literally the people that were there that only peacefully protested, peacefully redressed their grievances to their government, right? The vast majority did that, right? And those people were largely animated by a desire to emphasize how important this was to them. They flew in and drove in from across the country. Now, there's obviously a small group, much smaller group, thankfully, that didn't get the message on law and order, and the rhetoric didn't help that for sure on a lot of things. But what I think we do ourselves as a community, as a nation, a disservice is when we fail to recognize how we got here. Right. And that's my concern. I've gotten, you and I got some, a couple of common friends on Facebook, and, we started into this dialogue this last couple of days about whataboutism. And everybody's like, I can't talk about the past without being accused of whataboutism. Well, it's important to inform today's discussion on some of those historical things.
And whataboutism is unhelpful when it is used to do two things, in my opinion, just to simplify it: excuse wrong behavior, right? So it's like the eye for an eye, right? So, hey, you should not destroy someone's property. Well, that other guy destroyed property last week and you didn't have a problem with it. Okay, well, then it was interesting. So I posted a quote: the hypocrisy is the compliment that vice gives to virtue. Right? And I found it funny because a couple people who reached out to me about it, that you could clearly know that if somebody was on the left, they were taking offense because you were calling them a hypocrite. Several of them said that. And then, of course, several people on the right are like, yeah, I like this, right? Because they're a bunch of hypocrites. But,
careful, that mirror
you have to wait a second,
because
here's what I'm saying. If I tell you that they are hypocrites, it means that what just happened was wrong. Okay. If what happened was right, they're not, meaning they were right. That means they're right to call this out because it's virtuous to call out violence.
Right.
Which means they were hypocrites. Okay. But it also means
they
that
were
what was wrong
right?
is
Those
still
guys
wrong.
Were, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And, but I think so whataboutism has a benefit when you're talking about, hey, let's put this in context so that we can hopefully learn, right?
Yep.
Hey, you know what? If all of a sudden, let's say for simplicity's sake, half of the country that has thought that there was no problem with violence in the streets, and it's not really half, it's like 35% or whatever. So 35% of the country that has not had a problem with any of the violence that has happened in the streets in 2020, all of a sudden wake up one day and go, okay, now I see violence is a really bad thing to happen in the streets. It's really dangerous. It's really it hurts decorum, it hurts traditions, it hurts this thing. And then they go, okay, well, now let's establish that as what we should do moving forward in 2021. Right? Well, okay, let's all come together.
Right?
That's what
if we could agree on
is
that.
all about.
Yeah,
okay,
right.
great. But instead, you have these camps because, first of all, people who have been trying to scream about the problems with civil unrest have been, told that they're crazy and they're racist and they're all these things. And now they're being told that they're crazy for not being mad about the thing that they were mad about all year. So really unhealthy, not super helpful. And you don't see a heck of a lot of, I think proper viewing from what's happening, where it's coming from, any of that. I don't think we're going to fix that. I don't know that we're on a path to fix that anytime in the very near future.
Well, we need to. I mean, we need to think about that and pray about that, because there are definitely there's a growing chasm in our civic society that's going to be a cancer if it's not already, right?
Yep.
And so I worry about that. But you're right. There's nothing that's happened in the last 96 hours or so that would cause me to say, oh, we've learned the lesson collectively. Yep. We're in agreement on how to move forward from here. Battle lines continue to be drawn. Political points continue to be scored, or at least attempted to score, instead of helping the nation heal. And even that language of nation healing is loaded language now. And so everything viewed through the lens of politics is very caustic, I think, to not only our civic society, it's caustic to us as individuals. We need to transcend some of that stuff. But let's talk more politics. Yeah.
Well, and one of the inflections is that you and I both got much more involved in politics with the rise of the Tea Party that happened in 2010. And I remember that the media wanted to paint these people as like white supremacist, Nazi sympathizing, violent people. But the problem was none of the Tea Parties ended up erupting into any type of civic unrest, right? Nobody was like, now let's go storm the San Antonio City Hall, right? So because it never got there, it never really grew. The left in 2013 used violence and destruction of property and, literally riots to shut down the government in Texas. And then in 2020, we saw, a very leftist Marxist political movement use that violence. And that did not exemplify every single person that had an issue with racial injustice or anything, but it got basically supercharged within this entity that had a very leftist worldview and mindset and believed that violence was part of the solution. And then a bunch of politicians who encouraged that.
Well, let's make a clear distinction, because I think this is the same thing. We run the risk of committing the same thing that, as sort of a Tea Party conservative, that I was always very offended by, is being, there's one or two people that are white supremacist, racist nuts, right?
Some crazy guy.
And so we're all painted with that broad brush. So when you saw this past year, like the Black Lives Matter movement, you saw a lot of ordinary, reasonable people say, there is a problem. We need to work on this problem. And they stood in solidarity with that movement. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think that's a conversation that's long overdue. But what a lot of people are afraid to acknowledge is that the underpinnings of that movement, and particularly the founders of Black Lives Matter organization, right? Not the movement, not the banner that people are standing up and saying, this is enough, we need to stop this. But the founders and where that's being funded and how that's being funded are from devout Marxists that don't just want to redress their government for the grievances. They want to tear it all down because it was conceived in sin and there's nothing redeemable about our nation, right? That's what animates a lot of the activists driving those movements. Yes, it's a small percentage, but it's a huge reality that underpinning that movement is there. Now, does that mean that everybody should be tarred with that same brush? No, it shouldn't be, but we should be very wise about how we approach both that conversation. And one of the conversations that we were having over the last couple of days is I made the probably inartful or indelicate comparison that small remnant of folks that are driving that BLM movement. These Marxists, these America-hating Marxists. And is it 1% or 11.3%? It doesn't matter. There's a small nugget that is driving that. And I made that comparison that said, what's interesting about this is the same small cohort, the same tiny percentage of the overall movement that lost their way in the Capitol on Tuesday. They're not the same, right? They didn't go in demonstrate in the Capitol and really break every norm. And I want to be clear that even though I'm trying to contextualize some things here, there is nothing acceptable about what happened we saw in the Capitol. It broke my heart. It was lawless, and it was tragic in so many ways. What I do want to pull out and what I want to draw out from this conversation is an important distinction is we need to understand that those two movements are not the same, even though they ended up in similar places, and we're drawing some connections about what the behaviors over last summer have wrought, right? Those are not the same movements. These are people that are trying to restore America and call it back to its highest ideals. We should applaud that. Like they screwed up, like big time in how they approach that. But at their heart, for the most part, from everything I've seen, even some of the crazier, head-scratching radical things that are put out there, at their heart, they're trying to call us back to a restoration of our constitutional norms. The stuff that happened this summer isn't trying to do that. Yeah, maybe they're trying to call us back to some of those better ideals and the equality and justice and those sorts of things, which I'm not dismissing. Those are important, and we should have that conversation. But remember, they're not equivalent.
And so my point that I was going to within the one inflection that does happen, which I think gets into what does this mean for 2021, is that this was a group of people that are, in my opinion, you have people out there going, this is Antifa, this is this. And I'm like, okay, well, you can say whatever you want, but some of these people, I promise you, voted for Donald Trump. So, I mean, at the end of the day, whether you want to say it or not, some of these people were doing this, and they are right of center. And so from a right versus left perspective, the tactics that the left deployed throughout 2020, at the beginning of 2021, you saw some on the right, and I definitely don't, I think from everything that's been publicly said that and I guess this is a difference right to left, when the left got out there and started rioting, I mean, the politicians said, take to the streets, right? And in this situation, even Ted Cruz, who objected, I mean, I loved how they all said, will you now not object, which he didn't, which was brilliant for him, because his whole point was, I'm not going to let you define, why these people did what they did, because I'm objecting and because this happens. I'm allowed to, as a senator, take a position and make an argument and make a case that is a absolutely normal procedure that I can object to. And it doesn't matter if some crazy person's out there, similar to anybody on the left. So he didn't, but he also condemned everyone, said violence is never an option. Right. What would it look like if, when the left was violent, all the Democrat politicians said violence is not the option, and then every time somebody on the right was violent, all the politicians said violence is not an option. And so I think that's something to kind of take through. But a right of center group did take this much of an action. Not all of them.
Yeah.
So now the question is, going into 2021, we're going to have more battles. We're going to have disagreements on the federal level. In each and every single state, we're about to have a bunch of disagreements. And we can get into Texas in a second. But even in some of these states that went to Joe Biden, like a Pennsylvania, where you have a Republican-controlled legislature and a Democrat executive, I would forecast that there's going to be some rather healthy friction between these two groups, and that there will be actual live debates that will happen. And are people going to start thinking that narrative equals normative, and that now this is just what we can do? You know what I mean?
Let's hope not. I mean, let's be clear that is not the right approach. In civic discourse and redressing your government for grief, all those sorts of things need to play out within traditional norms. This isn't 1776. This isn't appropriate behavior. And I hope you're right in the sense that as those conversations occur and as those legislative battles get started, right? Because they're gonna, for sure. But I hope you're right about the fact that they're going to be peaceful and they're going to be up and on the better level. We don't see anything out of our national legislature. We don't see anything out of the U.S. Congress anymore that's close to reasonable debate on ideas. The way that they have perverted the way that legislation should get, at least here in Texas. There's still a lot of the back room, all that sort of stuff when you talk about that. But in reality, there still is a pretty public process to a lot of the legislative initiatives that get passed. And we do have those opportunities to go up to the Capitol and testify and those sorts of things.
Well, we'll get into that in just a second, because I think one of the big dangers that we'll see over the next week to two is whether or not the legislature tries to do away with a lot of that, right? I mean, COVID has definitely, any way a politician can use COVID for their benefit has seemed to be used for the most part. And so I would not put it past any of these politicians to say, hey, let's, kind of make this process a little less transparent. Let's give people a little less access.
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen, because the other thing that I believe is part of this groundswell of anger and frustration is because a lot in the right-leaning part of the country, the 75 million plus people who voted for the president to be reelected, a lot of what they feel is that Trump did give voice to some of the things that they're frustrated about. And so the fact that if you have something to say, if you feel so compelled that you need to say it, and now you're being prevented from saying it, that doesn't end well. When people feel like they have to go overboard, over the top, and do that. And so I would hope none of the legislative initiatives moving forward under the guise of COVID or public safety or any other reason does anything to restrict those opportunities for the public to comment and the public to participate in the legislative outcomes. It's a representative system we have, but that representative system, at least in Texas, has a great tradition of accepting and encouraging that public input. And
it's you saw, so this week the lieutenant governor came out and said, this is actually different than what the Texas House is going to do, but they're going to require testing to get into the building, right? But the other interesting thing I saw
to see your senator too, right?
Correct. Yeah. Now, he said most, so I think the scorecard actually broke some information. I know that Senator Lois Kolkhorst and Bob Hall have already come out and said that they're not requiring appointments to come into their office. There are a number, Donna Campbell and a couple of their Democrats, I think, did say that they were going to require an appointment to get into their office. And so you look at that and realize, like, just these little things, what they change, right? Yeah. You have a bunch of people. Here's what we know. On the left and on the right, you have quite a few people who feel completely disenfranchised.
That's right.
Meaning they don't, and that's an interesting place to be, where they're like, I don't feel like my voice is heard to the extent that I'm going to take to the streets. Meaning there is not a path for me to take this in a more, civil way. And probably the wrong message to send to some of these people is, hey, it's harder to get into a communicative situation with, the staff that work for your duly elected legislators.
Well,
and
let's think
what
about
kind of message will that send when people are trying to engage and barriers are put up? And I know, let me back up. I don't think that just requiring an appointment for your senator will lead to, if a riot happens in 4 months, I'm not going to say, this is what had happened with this appointment, but I'm saying, are our legislators recognizing like the level of how high the temperature is in the room?
Well, I don't think so. And whether it's reflected in limited hours or by appointment only, I can tell from the rhetoric that there's a missed lesson here in all this. I'm kind of contrarian on voter turnout. Like, I think a depressed voter turnout historically means the government's not screwing it up enough that people are riled up enough to go out and vote. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You can make that argument. Well, we're living through an age of increasing record turnouts, which means, and oh, by the way, polarization too, right? So people are hotter and they're madder and they're more active. And you're going to tell them, sit down, shut up. Like, this won't end well.
No. That is going to be and it's going to be bad on any of the important issues, which is why I think one of the dangers that we could see. So let's kind of shift to Texas here, because we're not here forever. I don't know how long we've been talking. We've been talking too long.
Yeah, we might have to break it 101st episode.
I know. No, we won't be doing that. Don't worry. So we, in Texas, one of the things I think is also, a concern I don't know if they're going to be able to hear, our people are going to hear this, but there's a ice cream truck driving. Nice. They'll probably hear a little bit of it in the background. They won't hear too much. But if you do hear that, no, my daughter might come running up into my office at some point begging to go out and get ice cream. We have this.
I want some too.
Yeah, we have this ice cream truck that drives over every afternoon, which I love living in a neighborhood that has an ice cream truck because I grew up with that. So in Texas, one of the things I think is a concern is that you are going to have politicians largely prone to avoid cultural issues. This is kind of one of the things that we've seen. In fact, the guy you ran against, Joe Strauss, was known for this, right? He basically said, hey, I want to keep things on bread and butter issues. I want to avoid the cultural buttons. I don't want to talk about abortion. I don't want to talk about immigration. I don't want to talk about guns. I don't want to talk about any of the things people are talking about. I don't want to talk about whether critical race theory should be taught in K through 12 schools. I don't want to talk about whether or not sex change surgery should be legal on, children that can begin getting therapy at the age of 3 to tell them they're the opposite gender, and then puberty blockers to never hit puberty and understand what their body would naturally feel, and then have sex change surgery in their teens. Like, I don't think that should be illegal. Okay, we're definitely not talking about that. Sure. Because if one of the goals is, hey, I don't want any of this stuff going on and the temperature's high, so the way to avoid it is to not talk about any of this stuff. I think one of the things we've learned is it doesn't matter whether you talk about it or not. It's being talked about. Yeah. It's going to happen. So the best way is for our politicians to actually say, hey, I'm an elected official. It's our job to handle this in a civil way, to have an actual discussion and debate and these things on it, as opposed to avoiding these things, because that's not going to help.
Well, and let's be clear about what is happening in this context of the social issues and everything. Is a lot of this dialogue is being framed by the media as Republicans trying to control your life, right? And really what we're having to recognize is that increasingly the dominant media and the dominant structures of control, whether they be through media or education or just sort of pop culture, is pushing an ideology, driving it down into our schools and into our culture. And so a lot of this is reflective of as a response to that. But to your point, it's essential. I think it's essential that you don't ignore the cancer. And I don't mean to necessarily mean every one of these issues is a cancer, but the reality is they're big issues, right? For a lot of people on both sides. And that's a fair thing for us to work through that. And that's why we elect legislators to go and wrestle and solve the hard problems. And so while I understand, it's much easier to do the bread and butter issues, right? Because actually they spend more every year and nobody wants to be fiscally restrained anymore anyway. So it's all about going up there and divvying it up and giving it out. That's kind of fun. I like being Santa Claus too. When on Christmas morning, it's great when you're giving out. Having to discipline your kids is a very different thing. It's uncomfortable, And so however that manifests over the coming legislative session, I sure hope that our legislators aren't afraid to tackle the hard problems, because it's not going to make them go away for sure.
What are a couple issues that you think Texas should address?
Well, so 6 months, like going back to this pandemic conversation, the election conversation, I think two of the big issues that we need to make sure that we're having an honest and open conversation about are election security. Now, again, I'm not going to get into this big argument about the election was stolen, but I think we can demonstrate that transparency is lacking, right? And therefore trust is lacking. I've been very vocal about the fact that believability is more important than the outcome. If we look at the long-term health of the republic, believability of elections is more important than any candidate winning. I dropped an article of the Federalist shortly after the election about executive overreach and judicial overreach. And so that was manifesting itself in election law. I do think the playing field was rigged after the teams took the field, right? That's a problem. Now, were the legislatures in those states impotent? Were they distracted? Were they ignorant? Were they asleep at the wheel? Yeah, I think all of those things. But getting it back to Texas, we need to make sure that our legislature, which, by the way, if we had that problem in Texas, remember, our legislature wouldn't have been in session to be able to do anything. And so whether it's election stuff or what we're seeing in a very real way over the last 9 months with executive overreach, I think is a reasonable way to couch this by our governor. We don't have any ability. And so there are some bills that have already been filed talking about you know what, maybe we shouldn't just give the governor unlimited power to even in the interest of public health. Now, there's a role for the government to play in these pandemic outbreaks. Awfully important conversation what the metes and bounds of that are. But maybe we shouldn't give the governor just carte blanche authority, unlimited.
Well, there's
right?
a role, but we can definitely know that they've completely abused the role.
I think it's
It's
whatever
not even
line
like
there was.
It's
well
It's
past
not
it.
that they're
Yeah.
teetering over the line.
Yeah.
They haven't just like played over. They've literally blown out the line, and it is whatever they
here
want
in
to do.
Texas too.
Yeah,
right.
It is.
It's
We're going
worse
to
in
govern
some of
your
the other
entire
states,
life,
but let's-
and not only are we going to govern your entire life, we're going to do it in an unscientific way. We're going to do it in a way that doesn't really make sense. We don't know. There's no rhyme or reason to 50% or 75%. There's no rhyme or reason to whether this industry can be open or this industry can be open. And half the time, it's probably whoever's industry has enough Austin connections to lobby the single executive enough to get him to be okay with their industry. And I mean, the dangerous precedent that sets up where every single industry is literally paying homage to one governor who can, with the stroke of a pen, wake up and say, you're not allowed to be in business. None of you are allowed to be in business. It's just crazy. So Matt Krause has filed legislation to say, basically, you can't put anybody out of work and still get a paycheck if you're a governing official. If a county judge is going to say, hey, all bars or salons have to close down, they can't get their salary. You cannot literally we are not a nation that actually, we are public servants, right? Yeah. So that's not a servant's mentality, right? Hey, you can't go to work, but I'm going to go to work. You can't make money. It's illegal for somebody to enter your business and pay you, but I've taxed everybody. I need to get my salary. And so in fact, I might even issue myself a pay raise this year. So that's been done a lot that say, hey, within a 60-day time period, you can call an emergency. And by the way, back up. This is not just an emergency about public health. Yeah, the emergencies are about anything, right? Yeah. I mean, the governor could call an emergency for gun violence and say, I have restricted gun stores in this way. Has nothing to do with public health. This is an emergency declaration for this. I mean, the governor called an emergency declaration to keep plumbing licenses around for 2 years, right? So this guy can literally say, anything I want is an emergency, and therefore I have unlimited power to create laws. And so hopefully the legislature is going to say, no, you don't. Let's rein that in. And then with election integrity, going back to the systems, the transparencies, whether or not they're allowed to break the law in the course of public health situations. Right. I mean, we had counties doing things that are not in election code. So they're just creating election law on their own. And we have a Secretary of State who at times was maybe even telling them, you can do that.
Sure.
So the Secretary of State who's appointed by the governor isn't actually telling these counties, hey, you have to follow the law.
Yeah.
So
faithfully
again,
executed, right?
Both Republicans and Democrats are basically saying the law is whatever we want it to be, which, by the way, makes sense when you have a governor who's saying the law is whatever I want it to be. I mean, wouldn't that be a logical conclusion that any governing official should reach in an environment? So you think election integrity and executive orders should be issues that are significantly considered this session?
Absolutely. And I think if those aren't reached, we've got bigger problems because all we're doing is whistling past the graveyard on what it means to be self-governed in a constitutional representative democracy, right? And I'm not trying to be overly wordy about that, but the reality is if we can't make sure that our system works the way we've designed it and the way that the public has entrusted our elected officials to operate, then we got problems. I mean, the check and balance time, it's time to cash that check and get serious about what it means to be checks and balances, to mix metaphors there for a sec.
So with the Federalist, I know you have a couple pieces that you've had out recently. Why don't you tell us about some of those and what you talked about?
Yeah. So, I think the one big thing in all of this is such a fast moving train with regards to the election is there's this entire sort of spectrum of belief on the election, right? Is that it was fair and efficient and the outcome was just in 50 different states, right? Mm-hmm. It's okay, maybe. And then on the other end of the election, it was, QAnon telling us that it was election hackers that were in Spain that were doing this. Pretty sure that's not the case either.
Yep.
Right. Somewhere in the middle. Now, was there fraud? You hear politicians, there's fraud in every election, we should minimize it. Yeah, sure. But were there things that happened? And this is what I saw in some of the states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Georgia, where you had ministerial officials. In the case of like Pennsylvania, their Secretary of State, like here, isn't an elected official. I'd love, by the way, we talked about legislative initiatives. I'd love to see our Secretary of State in Texas be elected official.
I'd love that.
It'd be amazing, because a lot of these election security measures would then be more accountable to the people. But so in Pennsylvania, you've got state officials elected on the executive branch that, frankly, everybody uses the word collusion and it's got all this terrible mindset, but colluded with Democrat, leftist funded legal aid societies and groups that litigated. They call it lawfare or friendly litigation to say, well, we need to change this. And then the state official says, oh, okay, I guess you're right. And then they have this out of court settlement. You heard the president very vehemently criticize Raffensperger and Brian Kemp there in Georgia about the consent decree, and in regards to how they administer their election. There were similar sorts of things that happened in all of these battleground states. And you can't look at those and say, yeah, that's open and transparent. So some of our articles went into that. And then it talked about a little bit about where we do with regard to presidential electors. Our Constitution does have a pretty clear, what they call plenary authority is granted to the state legislatures. And so it's not just a matter of, well, they maybe usurped it here or maybe they went too far there. It's a matter of, by our United States Constitution, is this permissible in a presidential election? I actually was a believer that those were pretty compelling arguments that some of those states had hopelessly messed up the outcomes in their election. Now, what I had wanted to do, and I have been very vocal about this, is not that the state legislatures should have convened to appoint an alternate slate, but I think the state legislatures who are closest to the people, closest to the voters in those states, should have convened to reaffirm, or if they truly believed that it wasn't fraud, or if they truly believe that it wasn't a valid outcome, then over will of the turn of the people, because that's the whole dialogue. Well, we're going to overturn the will of the people. Well, not necessarily. If you think it was fraudulent, then you're restoring the will of the people. Now you can make that argument.
But your point was that the appropriate, some of that Chip Roy articulated too. If
now,
you wanted to overturn Pennsylvania, then the Pennsylvania legislature should have done that, not objecting to the seating of the electors, which I don't want to get into that whole
right, exactly.
But you have a number of pieces that you had been publishing throughout this time to talk about both the fraud that, or the norms that had been broken in some of these states, the concerns that would bring, which also kind of makes that case that you're making now to say, there are some things we need to do in Texas today regarding our election process, because you see that in a time of crisis, all sorts of traditions and norms and laws and procedures that would be followed that would grant all people more trust within the electoral process. If they're thrown away, then now you have a situation where whoever loses is just going to feel like they were robbed.
Yeah. And that's I think the critical problem in the transparency about election. Now, as you well know, and we've talked about this before, elections can be very detailed. Like all of these, we're suffering through an amazing amount of data that's available. So we see election returns come in by the minute, and it turns out, well, that feed was actually just a summary feed. Oh, wait. So we see all of these things that are kind of out of whack. And you saw a lot of that with these midnight data dumps. Well, when a large county that's 90% Democrat tallies up all of their absentee ballots and they release them all at one time, you're going to see a huge spike. Now, not necessarily every spike in all of that data is reflective of that. Maybe there are some boogeymen in the shadows, right? But what has happened without clear, well-documented and consistently followed laws that have oversight and transparency, and that's why some of the throwing out the observers, to me, was such an offense to democracy and transparency, because you need people to be able to say, yeah, this was on the up and up. This is on the up and up. And if you can't say that, then all of these conspiracy theories develop, or frankly, that's when the malfeasance happens, right? And you've got every right to say, what happened behind that closed door? That's why we don't close the door, or at least we're not supposed to. So we don't have that level of problem in Texas. I think our problems are a little bit different with election security, but there are definitely areas where we can improve transparency, especially as we move more towards an automated, electronic balloting and that sort of thing. Frankly, I'm definitely on the side of limiting the reasons for absentee ballots. I think we should have less and less of that, not more and more of that.
Yeah, because it's growing in its use, and we should actually work to decrease its use as much as possible.
Now, the problem with that is I think that the cow's out of the barn. And so we're going to have a hard time reeling that back in. And so at a minimum, we need to make sure things like ballot harvesting, unattended drop boxes, those sorts of things are not allowed in Texas, continue to not be allowed in Texas. And we put measures in place to ensure that they're not happening.
Yep. Well, I mean, that's something that Republicans have really struggled with in Texas. We often let the other side define the narrative very easily, right? Yeah. So when we tried to pass photo ID, it was you're disenfranchising all these different people. And, each and every one of our efforts to make an election, just to bring about election integrity and make election more secure are often criticized by the other side as you don't want anybody to vote, right? And that actually got into what most of the left has said and all the media have said. Texas isn't really a red state. It's just a non-voting state.
Right.
If everyone showed up to vote, then it wouldn't be red. And then everyone showed up to vote, like more than ever. And we were just as red. Still red, you go, okay, we are red, and we can put in place measures that protect the integrity of the elections, and everyone can still vote. And if I tell somebody that you don't have the ability to vote by mail, I have not taken away your right to vote. That's right. I haven't disenfranchised you from voting. You have the ability. You have weeks of early voting. You have election day. You can show up. You can vote. You have access and ability. And we know you do because in this last election, tons of people who had never, ever, ever voted showed up and voted. And you know what you realized? I mean, I had a client who shook a hand of a guy who's in his 60s, right? And he says, I've never voted in a single election. I'm coming out to vote for Donald Trump. Okay, well, here's the thing. All these statisticians would look at this guy and go, oh, he's just disenfranchised. Well, he isn't disenfranchised because the laws don't allow him to vote, because he's not allowed an absentee ballot.
Right.
He didn't want to participate in the elections of the past. Yeah. He wants to participate now. He has a desire.
That's right. And that goes back to my earlier point about low voter turnout isn't necessarily the worst thing. It sort of means that the general population is
pretty happy. Yeah. It means they're like, hey, things are going pretty well.
Right track, wrong track.
I don't feel the need to get out and vote in my city elections because I think the city's okay. I don't feel the need to get out and vote in this election for midterms because I'm pretty happy with the direction of my state. I don't think things are going to change. So, well, Matt, thank you for coming in. Thank you for addressing some of these things. I don't think we fixed many of the world's problems, if not, or if any of the
Where's that
problems.
ice cream truck? Let's at least have some ice cream.
I know. I have some ice cream downstairs if you'd like to come.
All right, that'll work. Thanks for having me, Luke. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for watching the Luke Macias Show. This show is brought to you by Scorecard Media. Please visit TexasScorecard.com to read up on all things Texas. Scorecard also has multiple other podcasts. Now, they're not as good as this show, but you should still check them out. If you want to support our podcast, please consider subscribing on any of the platforms that you're listening to us on or watching us here on Facebook or YouTube. Leave a review as well. This helps other Texans find our content and allows our show to grow. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless Texas.